Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om den italienske thriller-, skräck- och science fiction-skaparen Mario Bava. En idag ganska bortglömd mästare, men hyllad av regissörer som Tim Burton, David Lynch, Joe Dante, John Landis, Quentin Tarantino och många fler, som anser honom vara en av tidernas bästa. Bava är målare som följde i sin fars fotspår som kameraman, special effects-fotografi, bland annat i Benito Mussolinis filmfabrik. Hans visuella stil var banbrytande för sin tid. Mycket stämning, färgad ljussättning, rök och skuggor, så förvandlade han mediokra filmmanus till något unikt. Dario Argento är definitivt en regissör som har blivit inspirerad av Bavas stil. Men Argento, alltid på blodigt allvar, så injicerade Bava ofta sina filmer med en bizarr svart humor, som tyvärr ibland gav resultatet att Bavas filmer stämplades som kalkonrullar. Humorn var alltid medveten, och de som jobbade med honom vittnar om en regissör med förkärlek för practical jokes, flams och trams, utan att det för den delen påverkade produktionens kvalitet. Tvärtom var den legendariska historien om när han filmade Danger Diabolique för en femtedel av den planerade budgeten och sedan lämnade tillbaka resterande pengarna till en chockad producent, Dino De Laurentiis. Det märkliga med de flesta av Bavas filmer är att det är svårt att återberätta handlingen, lite som när jag läser Clark Ashton Smith. Det är någonting i handlingen som är så simpel, nästan icke-existerande, samtidigt som de extravaganta visuella scenerna tar all plats och lämnar en med en känsla, lite som när man besökt en bra konstutställning, snarare än en biograf. Med oss i vanlig ordning har vi den fantastiske filmvetaren Troy Howarth som har skrivit boken The Haunted World of Mario Bava. Which one was the first Bava film you ever saw?
First Mario Bava film I ever saw was actually Baron Blood, which I think most people would agree isn't really one of his better movies, but it's an entertaining one, and it's, I think, a good example of how he could take a kind of a time-worn story and something that maybe wasn't all that extraordinary on the page and make it something quite good just through his mastery of the visual and the atmospheric and so forth. I saw that film when I was very young. I was probably, I was maybe around 6 or 7 years old, and my mother had been a big horror movie buff herself, and she used to record some of the late movies off of TV, and I would see them sometimes, and I saw Baron Blood, and it just made an impression on me because there was something about it that seemed different, and of course I had no idea at that time that it was a foreign movie, for example. I mean, when you're that young, what is your perception of the world? I mean, your world is as big as the backyard, so I had no idea that it was from another country, and it had been, actually I think it had actually been, like, many of them were filmed in English, and that one certainly was, because Alfredo Leone was the producer on that, and was very insistent that those films be shot in English. In any event, there was something different about it that just really stood out from all the kind of Universal and Hammer movies that I was accustomed to. Although in a way, Baron Blood kind of felt a little bit like what would have happened if Mario Bava had tried to do a film for Hammer. It was that kind of traditional storyline that wasn't necessarily breaking any new ground, but it was just the way that he treated it that made it interesting.
It does have maybe the best visuals of any Bava film as far as colors, light, smoke, deep camera perspective and production design goes.
It really benefited Alfredo Leone, who produced the film, saw to it that Bava had access to an actual castle. I can't remember the name of the castle, but it was an actual castle in Austria. And in fact, it was one of the very few times that Bava actually left Italy to make a film. He described himself as a homebody. He didn't like leaving Rome. He didn't like going outside of his comfort zone. He liked being around where his family and his friends were and his usual collaborators. So Alfredo Leone had found this castle in Austria and talked Bava into doing the film. He initially said he wasn't going to make it because he didn't want to travel. But Leone talked him into it and also gave him access to a very good cast. There are some quite interesting people in Baron Blood. And the production values are really evident on camera, and you could give Bava a location like that, and he knew how to photograph it and how to frame it and make it look absolutely extraordinary. So, yeah, in terms of the color and the texture and the ambiance, it really is definitely one of his most luscious-looking movies. I would agree with that.
So, what can be said about Bava, his upbringing, and his father, who was in the film business?
Well, his father was one of the real pioneers in Italian silent cinema, Eugenio Bava, and he was a cameraman and a special effects artist. And so Mario grew up basically in the midst of cinema production. I mean, really in the early days of filmmaking. He was born in 1914. So as a child growing up, he would go into his father's workshop a lot, and he was always fascinated seeing him creating a lot of different special effects and a lot of different film equipment and technical equipment that he had in his basically his sort of laboratory in the house. And he used to pitch in and help out, and he talked about how his father would develop film in the sink, you know, and they had to be careful because with the chemicals that were used, you didn't want to get it into the spaghetti. So, I mean, he really grew up in the midst of hands-on craftsmanship side of filmmaking, and he was fascinated by it. And his father actually didn't really want him to go into filmmaking as well. He felt it was too unpredictable a business and was not very encouraging. As a matter of fact, his father didn't seem to be a terribly encouraging man altogether, from what I can tell. Bava was devoted to him, but Eugenio was kind of a tough character and very very sparing in praise. You know, he really in one of his interviews, Bava talked about, he was talking to his father at one point about how he liked to improvise and how he liked to just sort of solve problems on the spot, and his father would say, well, you know, with an attitude like that, you're never going to be a Fellini or an Antonioni or anybody like that. So I don't think he really got a lot of validation from his father, although he learned a lot from him, and as a matter of fact, his father contributed to some of his films, including Black Sunday, where he actually sculpted the mask, which is hammered onto Barbara Steele's face at the beginning of the film. But Bava became fascinated with filmmaking. He was also interested in painting, and I've never had occasion, as far as I know, to actually see any of Bava's paintings that he did, but he reportedly was interested in possibly pursuing that as a career as well, but decided that filmmaking was probably a little more practical. So he broke into films and started working. For a long time, he actually did credits sequences. He designed credit sequences for different films, and then gradually worked his way up the ladder as a cinematographer and a special effects artist. And then, of course, as we know, as the time wore on throughout the 50s in particular, he found himself directing a lot of films without credit, basically films that had been kind of abandoned by other filmmakers, or films that needed a little bit of an extra push in order to get them finished on time. He was very, very resourceful and very clever, and he knew how to solve seemingly insurmountable problems with very, very simple means. So he was somebody that the producers always regarded as a great asset and a great money saver, because, you know, he knew that he could put something together that would look good without having to spend a lot of money, and he could always be relied upon to do that. So gradually throughout the 50s, particularly working with Riccardo Freda and Pietro Franchisi, he found himself basically rescuing some films that had gotten into some kind of trouble or other. Also, a film that Jacques Tourneur directed in Italy called The Giant of Marathon. Bava ended up finishing that film as well, and Jacques Tourneur was extremely impressed with him, said that really if we had more people like Bava in this industry, we'd be in a lot better shape, and I think he was probably right.
Bava's first real film, Black Sunday, also known as Mask of Satan, was a big inspiration on Tim Burton, and if you see the film you understand it. It echoes, look-wise, Edward Scissorhands and Sleepy Hollow.
As a result of rescuing a number of different films and completing them, he eventually was put in a position of being able to direct his own first feature. the producers were pretty much in a position to say, you know what, we appreciate what you've done for us. How about if you direct a film for us now? You can direct your own film. You can pick the subject. You can make it, obviously as long as it doesn't cost a lot of money. I mean, they weren't giving him the moon and the stars to work with, but as long as it was reasonably budgeted, they were fine with him picking a project. And he was a big fan of Russian literature. And he was especially fond of a Nikolai Gogol story called The V, which was a story that he apparently used to read to his children, including Lamberto Bava, who would go on to become a director himself. And it was a ghost story, a sort of horror story that he really, really liked. And he decided that it was time to try another horror film. The Hammer films, especially Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula, which had been released in Italy as La Maschera di Frankenstein and Dracula il Vampiro, were enormously successful, and so there was some interest in doing a horror film again. I Vampiri had been the first Italian horror film of the sound era, but it was a flop, and this was an attempt to kind of start that genre up again. And the title of the film was, the Italian title of the film is La Maschera del Demonio, which obviously quotes the Italian title for Curse of Frankenstein, which again was La Maschera di Frankenstein. So there was obviously an awareness of popularity with regards to horror films there, and Bava was able to capitalize on it. Finally, his horror films, by and large, were not successful in Italy, but they ended up mostly doing very well outside of Italy, especially in places like France and the UK and the US, where a number of his films were brought in, especially by American International. So La Maschera del Demonio, which became Black Sunday over here, it's how most American fans know the film best, was a film that he had a hand in adapting the script. He co-wrote the script. As he later said, in writing the script, he and his collaborators left very little of Gogol's story in the finished film. There really is very little similarity between them. But he was able to make a film that was, in its own way, was kind of perched between the old school expressionist horror films of the silent era and the early Universal era, and the more sort of blood and thunder approach of what Hammer was doing. And in its way, even though it was borrowing from these sources, it created its own very unique identity. And as far as the violence was concerned, it exceeded anything that Hammer had done up until that point, to an extent that actually the British censor refused to release the movie in the UK until 1968. So almost a decade went by before they actually allowed it to come into the UK, for example.
I klassisk tidsenlig italiensk B-filmsproduktion fanns det nästan inga säkerhetsåtgärder, och häxbålet i Black Sunday, som filmades i en studio, började plötsligt brinna ordentligt, så filmteamet fick panik och Barbara Steele kände att hennes sista stund var kommen. Bava gick maniskt all in i sin svartvita gotiska skräckfilm. Ingen ens bakom kameran fick ha på sig några färgade klädesplagg. Det ryktas även om att Bava var vidskeplig och att han hade en massa magiska tankar om vilka färger som fick förekomma både framför kameran och bakom. When you saw Black Sunday, what impressed you most about it?
It was the style, I think, above and beyond anything else, although it was definitely, again, it arose out of that sort of expressionist school, going all the way back to the silent era. But there was something very Italian about it as well, something very dramatic, very melodramatic in a way. And it's an aspect of Italian horror films that is sometimes, it's a little tricky for some people to get into them for this reason, because they do tend to have this kind of very overstated quality sometimes. They're very emotional, and they tend to have a great emphasis on the visual and the mood and the atmosphere, and all of that is basically encapsulated in Black Sunday. The story of Black Sunday is really nothing extraordinary. It's nothing super original, but the way it's treated visually is. It manages to make entire sequences where very little actually happens in terms of action extraordinarily engaging and involving, just by virtue of how visually appealing it is, and how, coming from a background as a cinematographer, he understood the value of cinematography and the value of camera placement and camera movement, and he photographed the film himself. as he usually did. He would give credit to other people on some of his later films, but they were more along the lines of operators. People like Ubaldo Tizzano and Antonio Rinaldi were more along the lines of camera operators, but Bava tended to do a lot of the lighting himself. But on this movie, he is actually credited as a cinematographer as well, and he would later say that in a horror film, the photography is 70% of its effectiveness, which I think is probably pretty much accurate. I mean, if you really create the right mood and atmosphere, you can get the desired effects.
So, what was his next great film?
His next great film, I mean, not to downplay how good some of these other films were, because they were quite good. I mean, Hercules in the Haunted World, Eric the Conqueror, The Girl Who Knew Too Much, they were all quite good. But yeah, Black Sabbath and The Whip and the Body were both done. Well, actually, Black Sabbath, The Whip and the Body, and Blood and Black Lace were done in pretty rapid succession between 1963 and 1964, and that's an extraordinary run of movies right there. All three of them are definitely among his best. Black Sabbath was kind of an attempt to explore three different styles of horror, and so you have a modern kind of sexy giallo type thriller story with the telephone segment. Then you have a kind of classic barnstorming gothic horror, you know, in the Hammer or Universal vein of the Vertilac with Boris Karloff. And then really the film's most extraordinary sequence is the one that best reflects the kind of horror that Bava himself was most interested in, and that was the Drop of Water segment. And it plays out, I think, as well as any film he ever did. And you can see this also in The Whip and the Body in particular. Bava's fascination with the emotions and fears encountered by a single person in a single room. I think we've all had this experience of, at some point or other in our lives, being alone in our room, hearing a noise, seeing a shadow, seeing something, hearing something that makes us afraid that something is in there with us that shouldn't be there. And whether it's as a child or as an adult or, you know, however it comes about, that was the kind of thing that really, really fascinated him. And the Drop of Water segment gives him an opportunity to really explore that. It's an absolute tour de force. I mean, if you were to take that segment as its own standalone little thing, I'd say it's probably the best thing that Bava ever did.
He really seemed obsessed with death, corpses, and necrophilia.
His filmography, there's a lot. there's a lot of death and decay, and that really kind of came to a head, I think, in Lisa and the Devil, which is almost kind of an ode to decay and necrophilia. It's not to say that Bava himself was a necrophiliac or anything of the kind, but he could see a certain kind of macabre poetry in this that was simultaneously kind of touching in a weird sort of way, but at the same time was also extremely disquieting and discomforting. In the Drop of Water segment, you have this dead medium, and it's a woman in a mask, and the mask, if I remember correctly, was designed by Bava's father, Eugenio. So it's this wax frozen face, which has been criticized by some people as looking phony, and it doesn't bother me because I think it's incredibly creepy and frightening. I think the images of the dead medium with her sort of frozen face approaching towards this hysterical guilt sort of struck protagonist is as scary as anything in 60s horror, or really from any vintage. I mean, it's incredibly creepy. There is that sort of real fascination with images of death and of the, a possibility of another world. I mean, Bava himself was, by his own description, he was apparently raised Catholic, but he described himself as being closer to sort of pagan in many respects. He wasn't really necessarily terribly a religious man, but he was very superstitious. And there's a lot of stories about him on his sets, sometimes people bringing certain props or certain colors of costumes or whatever, and him reacting in a way that would seem a little bit irrational, but he apparently had these sort of superstitions. I think also a healthy dosage of the possibility of, not wanting to upset something that was greater than himself, so to speak. His sister, I believe, was a Mother Superior in a church. He was sensitive to things like that, even if he himself wasn't necessarily terribly religious. But he definitely was fascinated by the possibility of life continuing somehow or other after death.
I remember Richard Stanley telling me a story about Bava's father being a mannequin maker, and him growing up around that might have put a mark on him and planted this almost fetish about mannequins.
He had a lot of these mannequins, and sometimes they were used in relation to his special effects film work. I'm sure some of it too was also the sculptures that his father was doing, and so you have the mannequin thing, but it's also there in Hatchet for the Honeymoon, for example, and Blood and Black Lace. In fact, in a weird sort of way, although I don't like the American title sequence that was done for Blood and Black Lace, where they changed this incredible title sequence that Bava did for the original, where the actors are all introduced standing next to kind of mannequin counterparts. Whoever did the title sequence for the American version of Blood and Black Lace at least picked up on that theme. So you do get these kind of animated mannequins going on during the title sequence. So in some funny sort of way, it was like they kind of understood.
Then he made his first science fiction film with another off-putting title, Planet of the Vampires, a film that would later inspire Hollywood filmmakers.
Planet of the Vampires is a great example of Bava taking the science fiction genre and giving it a very gothic flavor. It's very different from the other kind of science fiction movies that were being made in Italy at that time. Antonio Margheriti was seen as kind of Bava's rival in Italy at that time, in that he was also a special effects artist with a big fetish for miniatures. Antonio Margheriti films are renowned for their scenes with miniatures. Bava used miniatures too on occasion, as in Kaltiki the Immortal Monster, but his specialty was more along the lines of matte paintings and really creating scenery out of very crude but very effective means. Antonio Margheriti's science fiction movies are not particularly atmospheric, but they're heavy on action, they're heavy on incident, whereas Planet of the Vampires is kind of light on action and incident, but it's very, very heavy on mood and atmosphere. And it's one of those films that I think deserves to be called slightly Lovecraftian, in that it does convey the sense of a strange other world where there's some sort of unimaginable and impossible to visualize a horror or threat that's part of the landscape. In that film, they're shown only visually as kind of colored orbs, which are reflected onto the film, but in a sense they're almost kind of an invisible presence, and they basically possess the astronauts who come to this planet and answer to a distress signal. This film, which is called Planet of the Vampires in America, is misleadingly called Planet of the Vampires because there are really no conventional vampires in it. I guess it would be more appropriate to call it, I don't know, Planet of the Zombies or Planet of the Dead or something like that. The original Italian title was Terrore nello Spazio, which translates as Terror Out of Space, which I think is a pretty good title and has a little bit of a Lovecraft vibe to it itself. Kind of reminds me of The Color Out of Space. But it's a great example of what he could do with absolutely nothing. He had a bare soundstage at Cinecittà to create this environment, and what he did was utilize some plastic and styrofoam rock formations and whatnot from an old Hercules movie. Through using trick photography and multiple exposures and everything else, and lots of fog and lots of colored lights, he was able to create this incredibly eerie environment, which I think in its own way stands up very, very well. I mean, I think it compares very well to what you'll see in bigger later space movies like Alien, for example. Although, of course, when it comes to things like the special effects of ships floating through space, that doesn't look so good. But I'm sure it was okay for the time, but it looks a little dated now. But the planet itself is really an extraordinary creation.
There is some story elements in Planet of the Vampires that inspired Alien. The heroes receive a distress call from a strange planet covered with fog, get stalled there because in O'Bannon's original script they get stalled in a storm on that planet. And on the planet, like in Alien, there's also a huge skeleton of a strange alien beast that gets no explanation. That is, if you disregard the Prometheus film.
I'm sure Dan O'Bannon did. I very much doubt that Ridley Scott ever saw it. I don't get the impression that Ridley Scott would be sitting down to watch AIP double features when he was a kid. So I kind of doubt that he saw it, but I'm convinced that Dan O'Bannon did because he was a big fan of horror and science fiction. So how would he have been able to resist a film called Planet of the Vampires? And he was probably aware of Mario Bava as well, because Bava had achieved some recognition in the American kind of cult horror scene because of his movies coming out here through American International. So yeah, there are definitely elements that influenced Alien. Obviously, they were never credited. And I don't know if Bava himself was ever aware of that. I mean, obviously, he died the year after Alien came out. I'm not sure when Alien came out in Italian theaters, if he would have had a chance to see it or not. But, of course, there were other films that were very much influenced by him as well. But Alien's a good example.
Okay, let's jump right into Kill Baby Kill.
Kill Baby Kill is undoubtedly one of his great films, and I've seen it so many times down through the years in various copies that were just so faded and brown and muddy. And I was absolutely thrilled. I recently watched the Coke edition Blu-ray from Germany. And it was like seeing the movie for the first time, just in terms of really being able to appreciate that artistry that's evident in the film throughout, in the lighting and the color and everything else. It was kind of like seeing the Blood and Black Lace release that Arrow put out a few years back, and finally being able to see something that really showed the color and the texture the way that it was intended to be seen. So that was, I just saw that disc just recently within the last week, and it was a wonderful experience to finally see this film the way it should be seen.
I remember Richard Stanley telling me that this was his favorite Bava film. The film also has a strange, surreal moment that apparently impressed David Lynch very much, and when you see that scene you understand why. When I think of the story, I usually forget it. What is it? Is it the story very simple or very complex?
Well, it tells of a small village, which is kind of vaguely defined, as is often the case in these movies. It's kind of set in a vaguely fairy tale Never Never Land. It's identified as Kernighan, which sounds sort of German, but it's hard to say where the film is actually meant to be set. I've seen synopsis which describes the film as being set in Transylvania, for example, so I guess it's set wherever you want it to be set. And basically it's a small village which is being beset by a series of unusual deaths that are all being ruled as suicide. A coroner is called in to investigate, and he discovers that the bodies are not only being hurriedly buried, but also they always have a gold coin embedded in their hearts. And he discovers that this is a local superstition, that this basically, by putting the gold coin in the heart, it'll keep the bodies from rising from the dead and wreaking havoc. And basically he uncovers this sort of collective paranoia and fear, which all stems from the death of a little girl many years before. And it turns out that there is a plot whereby this girl's spirit has been brought back to seek revenge on the village, basically because she had been trampled to death and left to bleed to death while everybody was partying and have a good time. So it's an interesting story. It's a good little story, but again, it's a supreme example of atmosphere and mood. And also, what's interesting about it is the fact that Bava really turns a lot of expectations on its head. He really inverts a lot of the conventional symbols of good and evil in this film. So you have a black-clad sorceress who is introduced very much like Barbara Steele is in Black Sunday. And you assume, she's the villain, but in fact she turns out to be the hero. She's the sympathetic figure in the village. the monster, so to speak, is a little girl dressed in white with sort of blonde hair, and it's an extraordinary kind of reversal of what you expect to see in these films. It also has an extraordinary sequence that has been quoted by other filmmakers, including David Lynch, where the hero, played by Giacomo Rossi Stewart, is plunged into kind of a state of delirium, and he ends up chasing this character through a room. And it's almost sort of a play on the use of background animation in a lot of old cartoons, where it's the same room over and over and over again, and eventually catches up with the figure that he's chasing, and it turns out to be himself. So it ends up, it's this extraordinary, unexpected kind of twist on the kind of thing that you normally see in horror films. It's a very subtle movie, in fact, and it was given a really horrible title of Kill Baby Kill in the U.S. The Italian title was Operazione Paura, which translates as Operation Fear, and that's not much better. The British title, I believe, was Curse of the Dead or Curse of the Living Dead, something like that. So it's never really had a really good title that suited it. Kill Baby Kill makes it sound like it's some kind of a Russ Meyer exploitation movie or something, and it's an incredibly subtle movie. The only bloodshed really in it occurs in the opening scene, where a girl falls onto a spiked railing and is impaled. But even that's not shown in graphic, gory detail. It's all about mood and atmosphere, and really establishing a strong sense of dread and unease. It's not a movie that relies on shock effects, really. So it's one of the great sort of subtle horror films, and definitely, I think, also one of the best ghost stories ever put on film.
I think Kill Baby Kill was my first Bava film. Do you remember when you first saw it?
It was one of those films that, again, for many, many years, it was not treated well on video. And the first version I saw of it was extremely in rough shape, and it had the colors were very brown, and it didn't make a huge impression on me for obvious reasons. It's a movie you really need to see in good shape in order to really appreciate its atmosphere. You can't really put it into words. It's just something you have to experience. It's a mood piece, and I think for that reason it's one of those movies I've noticed that people either seem to really, really like it or they don't like it at all. I have talked to some people, amazingly, it seems to me amazingly, who like Bava, who say the movie's boring. I guess it would be. I mean, if you're not invested in it, it's true, there's not really a lot that happens on a certain level. It's not a movie that's loaded with action and so forth, but I think the mood and the atmosphere is so overwhelming and so overpowering. It just totally puts me under a spell, right from the opening frames the whole way through to the end. Although I will say, I do think, and I know that Tim Lucas alludes to this in his book on Bava, that there was probably a bit of confusion about the ending, because I suspect, we know that the film ran out of money very early on. As a matter of fact, even recently I was talking with the actress Fabienne Dali, who plays the sorceress Ruth online, and she told me the same thing that others have said about the film. She was never paid for it. Bava himself was never paid. Basically, the producers ran off with the money, and the film was only finished through sheer goodwill, because everybody decided that it was a movie that was worth completing and not abandoning. I think a more ambitious ending was probably originally planned, with the spirits of the dead returning to get their revenge on the Baroness. So what you have at the end now is feels a little bit rushed and a little bit arbitrary, but it works okay. And on the whole, I think it's not my favorite Bava film, but it's certainly within the top 5 for sure.
Do you have a favorite scene in it?
Scene where Giacomo Rossi Stewart is chasing, effectively chasing himself through that room is a great one. But I really love the scene where Giacomo Rossi Stewart and Erica Blank are performing the autopsy on Irina Hollander. And outside, intercut with this, we're being introduced basically to the ghost. And there's this fantastic sequence where the camera is sort of zooming in and out, and then cranes down, and the little girl's legs swing into frame as she's on a swing. and it's in this misty, dark, very colorful graveyard, and this ghostly figure just swings into frame on a swing. That always just gives me goose pimples every time I see it. Kill Baby Kill apparently did better at the Italian box office than a lot of his other horror films had done. That kind of movie was pretty much on its way out, and everybody knew it. A film that's kind of in the mix there that we didn't discuss, and for good reason, because it's not a good film. It's one of the very few bad films he ever did, was a movie called Dr. Goldfoot and the Girl Bombs, which, in fairness, the original Italian version, if you ever get a chance to see the Italian version, is a very different film, and that's the movie that Bava actually supervised and finished and completed. The American version was dubbed and rescored and re-edited without his participation, and it's awful. But that film was made I think right before Kill Baby Kill, was amazingly the most successful film he ever made in Italy. And the reason for that was that it was a vehicle. It was promoted in the U.S. as a vehicle for Vincent Price, but in Italy it was sold as a Franco and Ciccio movie. Now, if you know Franco and Ciccio, they were a Sicilian comedy duo who made over 100 movies in the space of like 10 years or so. I mean, they had an extraordinary run of success, but their movies don't seem to translate very well to non-Italian audiences. But they made that movie into a big hit. And I think Bava saw that as an opportunity to, well, maybe it's time to get away from the castles and the crypts, and let's try something a little bit more modern. And, maybe, hopefully, I can start making movies that actually people want to see. The Gothic period was kind of ending. That type of movie was pretty much going out the door. There weren't really a lot of Gothic horror films made in Italy after 1966, quite frankly.
Sen gjorde Bava Danger Diabolik, baserad på en populär tecknad serietidning, Diabolik, skapad av systrarna Angela och Luciana Gussani. Systrarna hade noterat att många pendlare läste thriller och mysteriepocket på lokaltrafiken, och därför kläckte de idén om en serietidning i pocketformat på samma tema, och antihjälten Diabolik föddes 1962. Värt att notera var tidens anda, en bitterhet hos det italienska folket, därav denna antisuperhjälte som skiter i det mesta, tar från de rika och ger till sig själv, knullar storbystade blondiner i säng fylld av pengar. Det känns lite grann som att Italien snarare än USA var det landet som var tvungen att producera filmen om det skulle nu bli en film överhuvudtaget.
Diabolic was kind of a perfect venue for him to transition into something that was more modern, but also a bigger film, and it was far and away the biggest film he ever directed. It was produced by Dino De Laurentiis, and it was conceived as a big project. It was being made back to back with Barbarella, and these were both films based off of popular fumetti, sort of adult comic strips that were very, very popular and tended to have a more adult slant, so there was a lot of sex, a lot of violence, and so forth. Diabolic was actually one of the more violent fumetti comics, and he found himself in a position of making this film, but being told by De Laurentiis that he wanted it to be a more mainstream film, so leave the violence out, which obviously troubled him. He found some ways around that. There is some violence in the film, but it certainly isn't as brutal as some of his other horror films had been, or would be after that.
There is this famous story about Bava making Diabolik for a fifth of the estimated budget.
He was given, I don't know if this is somewhat apocryphal or not. I mean, sometimes when budgets are talked about, producers are prone to enlarging things to make it sound better than it was, but he was reportedly given a budget of about, I think, $3 million, which in 1967 terms was pretty large, certainly a lot larger than anything he had had before, and he ended up making the film for only about $400,000, and obviously Dino De Laurentiis was overjoyed and said, hey, you've got all this money left over, why don't you make a sequel? But Bava hated making the film so much because he wasn't accustomed to working for a producer like De Laurentiis, who was very hands-on and very involved and was always checking on things and always, being a busybody. He didn't like that. He wanted to get back to making low-budget movies, so he said, no, Diabolic's dead. I'm not making another one. It was a film that had been started before under different circumstances by the British director Seth Holt, who's well known for directing a couple of Hammer films like Taste of Fear and The Nanny. It was to have starred Jean Sorel and I believe Elsa Martinelli in the lead roles. And that project kind of broke down and stopped, and the footage was scrapped, and it was never finished. I think that was back around 1965. And then in the meantime, De Laurentiis ended up with the rights and started it over as a much bigger film, at which point Bava was brought into it. And the original idea was to cast, I think there had still been talk about casting Jean Sorel as Diabolik, but Bava fought for Jean-Philippe Law, who was indeed perfect for it. And he had originally cast Catherine Deneuve to play Eva. And apparently, Bava was well known for being a very quiet, low-key kind of a guy. He was not a difficult man to get along with. And he was very easygoing with his actors, but he did expect them to be professional. So Catherine Deneuve, although she knew that she was to do a scene where she was to make love with Diabolik in a pile full of money, and it was done in such a way that it was very tasteful. You actually couldn't see anything. There was no actual nudity that you would see on screen. She refused to do the scene. And Bava, rather uncharacteristically from what I can gather, lost his temper with her and basically fired her on the spot. And so that was the end of Catherine Deneuve. So then they had to start up again with another actress, and Bava selected Marissa Mell, who was the perfect choice anyway. I mean, I can't imagine Catherine Deneuve being as effective in that part, although she was a great actress. I don't think that she would have had quite that same sexy quality and that same wonderful chemistry that Marissa Mell had with Jean-Philippe Law. So there again, a movie that, even with the problems of starting with another actress and having to go back and reshoot, he brought it in very, very much under budget, all just from using his usual methods of, instead of building huge sets, he could create things through miniatures and matte paintings and things like that. And yeah, it's an extraordinary thing. You don't very often hear about directors bringing movies in, massively under budget. It's usually the opposite.
Although it is in a way a comic book superhero, and even by today's standards, pretty out there.
You can't really call it a superhero movie, can you? It's more of a supervillain movie. Diabolik's all about just killing and stealing just for the hell of it. It's a very wicked and amoral film, which is of course very consistent with Bava's attitude in general. He was not a moralistic filmmaker. In other words, he would just tend to sort of show these characters for what they were without really sort of passing moral judgments on them. As a comic strip adaptation, whatever you want to call it, I think it's about the best of its kind. And Ennio Morricone contributes his only score for a Bava film, and it's a great one. It's definitely one of his best scores. And it's just wonderfully entertaining. It may be arguably a little overlong. It runs probably 15 minutes longer than the average Bava film. It might have benefited from being cut down just a little. But on the whole, I think it is a film with tremendous energy and tremendous drive and just a great sense of humor. Really showed that there was more to Bava than just moody, atmospheric horror movies.
Next, according to me, a pretty lame film. I don't know, do we have anything to say about $5 for an August Moon?
I have lots to say on $5 for an August Moon. That was a film that Bava basically was always saying that he could not, he was not in a position to be able to turn down projects when they were offered to him. We know that's really not true, that there were different films that he didn't do for one reason or another, but he had signed an agreement to do a couple of films for this production company. This was a case of a film that was originally supposed to be directed by somebody else. I forget who the theory is as to who was to direct it. I don't think we know for sure, but there's been some theories advanced as to who was going to direct it. I forget who it was, though. It wasn't anybody well known. And basically this director had bailed at the last second. The movie had already been cast. It was already written. It was already pretty much ready to go. Bava said that he was called on a Friday and was obliged to start shooting the following day. He hated the script, and he actually ad-libbed a lot of the movie. He said about how the script was just a wretched version of 10 Little Indians, which is pretty much true. And so he decided to have some fun with it. He basically improvised this very deliberately idiosyncratic and very strange movie that goes against all expectations. If you go into a giallo expecting a certain kind of a movie, this one really leaves you disappointed, I'm sure, because all the killings kind of take place off camera. There's really no blood. The characters are deliberately unsympathetic, and it's done in this very, very pop art style. There's a lot of zooms in that film, and Bava was criticized sometimes for overusing the zoom. I think he used it very well, but he is using it a lot here. It's kind of like a Jess Franco movie a little bit, but I think it's a very interesting movie. I think it's gorgeous looking, for one thing, and for another, it has an extraordinary score by Piero Umiliani, which is really just one of those soundtracks, once you get it into your head, it stays with you for days. I think it's a fun movie. I do think that there are problems with it, and I think you can kind of tell that he approached the movie with a little bit of contempt, but I think it's a good example of what a really good director could do with a bad script. Had this movie been directed by like an Antonio Margheriti or somebody like that, I don't think anybody would care about it. But the movie is some really special, I think brilliant moments, thanks pretty much to Bava.
Then came Hatchet for the honeymoon.
The film started sometime in 1968. There were some money problems or something or other, and so it ended up being shut down and then restarted. So at the end of the day, the movie didn't actually come out until 1970, although it's a very 1960s movie. It is actually a 1970 release. It was, again, a very unusual case of Bava being lured outside of Italy to make a movie. So it was shot in Barcelona. In fact, it's actually the interiors of the protagonist's house were shot in at the palace of Generalissimo Francisco Franco. And Bava always told the story about the movie being so tame with regards to blood because they were filming in this place and there were guards around, and if he would have gotten blood on the carpets, he probably would have been executed. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a funny story. It kind of continues the fashion house theme of Blood and Black Lace, but also plays a little bit like a giallo version of a Buñuel film called, if I remember correctly, it's called The Criminal Life of Archibald de la Cruz. And it deals with this kind of a Bluebeard kind of a character, this man who has this psychological block with regards to something that happened to him in his childhood, and he has some pretty serious sexual hang-ups. And he gets his gratification from basically killing virginal brides in their wedding gowns. It's a dark comedy in many respects. It's I think very witty movie, very funny in parts. I hated it when I first saw it. I really don't know why, but I hated it when I first saw it. But I've grown to like it a lot down through the years. I think it's a very interesting movie. It was written by a very, very talented, very interesting Spanish screenwriter named Santiago Moncada, who wrote quite a few very interesting Spanish genre films in the 70s. And the story goes that Bava took the script and decided to emphasize aspects that weren't entirely present in the original script. He really brought in, apparently, if the stories are true, he really brought in the whole fractured marriage angle with regards to the killer and his wife, who basically hate each other and are pretty much only married out of convenience. It could be, it's been said that there's a little bit of, not necessarily autobiography in that, but there was a little touch of something personal about that in the sense that Bava's own marriage was not entirely happy. Apparently his wife, to whom he was married for many years, he was married to her till the day he died, had a lot of mental health problems, and so there were some difficulties there with her depression and her anxiety, and she was something of a hypochondriac, and apparently put on a lot of weight, and so home life wasn't always great for him, apparently, and so I think some of that probably informed the decision to really emphasize that aspect of the story. It's a giallo in a sense, but at the same time it's a very unorthodox one because you know who the killer is right from the get-go. So it's not so much a whodunit as a why did he do it.
His next film would become his most influential, inspiring the whole slasher genre that would explode 10 years later. The film was Bay of Blood, with two major scenes directly copied in Friday the 13th. The axe in the face, and most notably, the spear impaling the two lovers in the bed.
There's no doubt that that's true, although I think sometimes people are a little bit, they go a little over the top with that. I don't think that Friday the 13th is a direct steal from this movie. Sean Cunningham, who directed Friday the 13th, said that he hadn't seen the film at the time. Now, I don't know if I believe that, because Sean Cunningham was involved with a company called Hallmark Releasing. They had put out, of course, Last House on the Left, which he was involved with Wes Craven. And Bay of Blood was released over in the United States at one point through Hallmark as Last House on the Left Part 2. So I'm sure he probably saw it. It had nothing to do with the Craven film, of course. It's a very different movie. As a matter of fact, it was made before. It was made in 1971 as opposed to 1972 for Craven's movie. But it's another example of Bava taking the giallo format and just kind of taking it in a very different direction. It's, again, very darkly comic, and it's interesting because the movie starts off with a murder, which is typical in these movies, but then, you have the killer with the black gloves, and the camera pans up and it shows you his face. So that's unusual. You're seeing who the killer is right off the bat, but then he's killed off by somebody else. And so basically you have this sort of chain reaction. As a matter of fact, one of the Italian titles for the film was Chain Reaction. It's a very appropriate title. A chain reaction of killings. You have 13 characters and 13 spectacular death scenes. The makeup effects were done by Carlo Rambaldi, who was a disciple of Bava's. This was obviously before he became very famous for working on things like Alien and E.T., and it's one of the bloodiest films of the decade. It's incredibly gory in its uncut version, but it's done in a way that's very sardonic, so it's not as unpleasant as it could have been. It again plays out very much as a dark comedy, and it builds to a really wonderful little twist ending that I think is one of the best that Bava ever did.
What can we say about this next film, Baron Blood?
I mean, Baron Blood was, on the face of it, was kind of a step backward after Bay of Blood in a sense, but in a way it was also an opportunity for him to kind of revisit his old stomping ground with a kind of gothic film. But it's a gothic film set in the current day, so it is line things that were going on in the 70s, like the Count Yorga films and the Blackula films, and even Hammer's last two Dracula films, which were set in the current day, Dracula AD 1972 and The Satanic Rites of Dracula. There was a lot of attempts at this time to sort of take the old Gothic stuff and put it into a contemporary setting, and some of them work better than others. Baron Blood was shot in Austria, made use of a actual castle with some extraordinary furnishings and so forth. It's a gorgeous looking movie. It has a very good cast. Joseph Cotten plays the lead character, who I think is not terribly surprising. Turns out to be Baron Blood, but it's kind of a variation on House of Wax, where you have this character who's apparently benign and in a wheelchair who suddenly gets up at the end of the film and you realize that he's actually the monster. Matter of fact, with House of Wax being mentioned, it was originally intended to star Vincent Price, and Price turned it down, I think because he didn't want to work with Bava again. They had worked on Dr. Goldfoot together, and Price was one of the very few people who had a bad experience working with him. Most people loved working with Bava, but they didn't appear to get along all that well, I think for a variety of different reasons. So it ended up being played by Joseph Cotten, become famous thanks to movies like Citizen Kane. So quite a classy cast and good production values, and even if the story itself is kind of slight, it's another good example of just really rich atmosphere and just basically a fun movie to watch.
Do you know why Vincent Price had such a bad experience on Dr. Goldfoot?
Well, it seems as though that the shoot of Dr. Goldfoot was not a particularly happy one, and Bava found himself in a very difficult position on that movie because he was being asked by two sets of producers to basically make two different movies. AIP co-produced that movie with Italian International. So the Italian International producers wanted a sequel to a Franco and Ciccio spy comedy that had been called The Amazing Dr. G. American International wanted a sequel to Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine. So obviously that created problems, and Bava was apparently going through a bad period. He was very depressed. His mother had passed away. His father was not long for this world either. He was having a lot of problems with his wife. He apparently was not in the greatest of moods when he made that film, and he never really talked about it, funnily enough. But Luigi Cozzi told me that when he first met Bava, it was during that time, around that time frame, that he was making Dr. Goldfoot, and he said, of course, the first question I had to ask him is, what's Vincent Price like? And Bava just looked at him and said, oh, he's such a pain in the ass. All he wants to do is talk about statues all the time. So they didn't get along. I don't know. It's very unusual because Bava seemed to get along with just about everybody. But because Dr. Goldfoot turned out to be such a bad film in America, and that probably is the only way that Vincent Price ever saw it, he would later say, I don't know what happened to Bava on that film because Christopher Lee had told me he was great. Boris Karloff said he was the best director he ever worked with. He said he must have had a bad day with me because that movie was awful. And he was right. The version that he was talking about was awful. So Price, I think, after that basically said, nah, I don't think I want to work with him again. And
Lisa and the Devil really is a fantastic film. A real one-of-a-kind cult film in the truest sense of the word. The story is really funny in a psychedelic kind of way. How would you describe this to the listeners?
A tough one to describe. It's about a tourist who gets lost basically in this Spanish city. And she finds refuge at a house, a very strange house that's presided over by this butler, played by Telly Savalas, who resembles very much a portrait of the devil that she'd seen earlier in a fresco in the town square. And the house is occupied by all these sort of strange people, and it seems to be very much a place that's kind of out of step with the times. It almost feels as though it's from a different era. And she goes through all these experiences, and ultimately, basically, the idea is that this woman really doesn't truly exist. She is, in fact, a kind of doppelganger figure for this woman who is involved in a very complicated and very kinky sort of scenario of the people, of the family, and the people in this house, in this villa, who are being basically punished by the devil for their sins by reenacting the things that they've done and the sins that they've committed for eternity. So basically, it's this sort of circular thing of just reliving these awful experiences over and over and over again and trying to escape from them. And of course, that's kind of the theme of the film, is that there's no escaping from your fate, no matter how hard you may try. What you are fated to endure, you must endure. So it's a very dreamlike and very nightmarish film.
I've heard that Bava's films, and in particular Lisa and the Devil, that it was a very popular thing to watch it on psychedelic drugs, and in those cult film art house film theaters, there were rows of spaced out kids rolling on the floor laughing.
Bava himself was pretty much as straight and narrow as you could be. He was not. I don't think he was not interested in what could be termed psychedelic culture. I don't think, personally, I'm not an advocate of watching films in altered states, so to speak, because I think very often you're not really understanding. You're applying something to the film that you shouldn't be applying to it. It is a comical film, and a lot of his films are. As a matter of fact, when I was writing my book on Bava, I toyed with the idea of calling the book Blood and Black Humor, only because it seems to me that there's a lot of dark comedy throughout his movies. It's very evident in Lisa and the Devil, and that comes down, a lot of it, to Telly Savalas, who I think is brilliant, and he gives an extraordinary performance. And of course, it's a story that's been told 1,000 times, but I'll tell it anyway. In the script, he was originally supposed to be eating grapes, as a means of kind of curtailing his desire to smoke, because his employer doesn't want him smoking. when the time came to make the film, Savalas told Bava, I don't really like grapes. What if, how about if I use gumdrops instead? And Bava said, well, if you want to change it, why don't you do something really different and use a lollipop? And Savalas liked the idea of the lollipop, so he used it. And so when he finished the film, he had already done the pilot version of Kojak. He had already done the Marcus Nielsen Murders, which was a very highly rated TV movie. When Kojak became a TV show, and it became a hugely successful TV show in America. I don't know if it's well known elsewhere, but it was hugely successful here. He started using the lollipop, so that became kind of like his symbol, his avatar was the lollipop. And so that all started with Lisa and the Devil, based on a little offhanded comment that Mario Bava made to him. He's hysterical, and I think a lot of his dialogue in the film is probably ad-libbed, because he has all these wonderful little funny comic asides throughout the film that I don't think were probably scripted.
Do you have a favorite Savalas scene in that film?
He talks to the stuffed rabbit at one point, good evening, Mr. Rabbit, or is it Mr. Hare? Would you like a radish? No? Oh, they're very good. He just does all these weird little things. He talks to the dummies a lot. He's always carrying around these mannequins, and he just at one point the one mannequin's face has been cracked, and he's putting super glue on it to make sure he can fix it, and he slaps it across the face. It's all these things that he does that are just so funny that I'm sure that he probably was improvising a good bit during the film, but I'm glad he did, because he really it's a very it might have been a little too serious and a little too somber if it weren't for him. And I think that's why Bava allowed him to do it, because he obviously, if he didn't like what he was doing, he would have said, no, this is supposed to be serious. The humor works.
Do you have any interesting facts about how this film came to be?
I'll tell you a couple of things about the film that are I think are very interesting anyway. One is the fact that basically the film came about because Baron Blood had been very successful. And Alfredo Leone was absolutely amazed by Mario Bava. He thought he was a genius, and he saw himself basically producing films for Bava for the rest of his career. So he basically went to Bava and said, you know what, you did such a good job with Baron, you brought it in on time and on budget and everything else. Is there something you would like to do? Is there a project you'd really like to do? And as it happened, Bava had worked with the screenwriters of Kill Baby Kill on a treatment called The Devil and the Dead. And he had been carrying this with him for years and had wanted to make this film, and nobody wanted to make it. Because, again, that kind of gothic horror film had gone out of style. So Leone said, well, I'll tell you what, if you want to make this film, I'll back it. I'll make it for you. He gave him a very large budget, and he gave him creative freedom to make the film the way he wanted to. And in fact, he tried to give the film an all-star cast. He really was reaching for the stars, literally, in this case. As we know, of course, Telly Savalas and Elke Sommer top-lined the film, but he originally tried to get people like Louis Jourdan to play a role. He wanted to get Bette Davis. He wanted to get Anthony Perkins. He tried to get Burt Lancaster. So you can imagine that, it was quite a unusual experience for an Italian horror film to even try for people like this. They didn't end up getting them, but the point is at least they tried. So obviously the movie had a bigger budget than usual. At one point during the filming, Sam Arkoff from American International, who had released a lot of Bava's films in the U.S., went to Alfredo Leone and said, I'll buy this movie from you for whatever number of dollars. I'll buy it for America. And Leone thought he had like an Oscar-winning movie on his hands. He thought he was making this movie that was just going to take the art house by storm. And he said, no, I want twice as much as what you want. And Arkoff said no, and so that was that. Flash forward later, he took the film to the Cannes Film Festival in 1973, out of competition. It wasn't competing, but it was showing there to prospective distributors and so forth. And basically nobody wanted it. Nobody understood what the movie was all about. They didn't get the combination of kind of the art house aspects and the horror aspects. It was one of those movies that was a little too art house for the grindhouse, and it was too grindhouse for the art house. So basically nobody was interested in distributing it. And he went back to Arkoff and said, well, I've rethought your offer. I'll take the money. And Arkoff said no. Because at that point it was like, we don't know what to do with this movie. It's too weird. Which it was. I mean, you can't really imagine that film going out on a typical horror double bill of the time. It was just too strange. I forget for how long. I think it was close to about a year and a half. They pretty much sat on the film. It had come out in Spain. It was a Spanish co-production. And it was largely filmed in Spain. The exteriors were all shot in Spain, for example. For the most part, they were shot in Spain. So basically, Alfredo Leone was in a position of needing to recoup his investment, which he placed around $1 million. He might be kind of padding the budget a little bit there. I'm not sure, but he always maintained it was $1 million. And so there was a need to recoup his investment. He went to Bava and said, look, I'm sorry, I gave you the time and the money and the freedom to do what you wanted, but nobody wants it. We got to fix this. So he had actually, at some point during the pre-production of Lisa and the Devil, he had sent, it would have been after the film was finished. I think during that time where they were, trying to figure out what to do with the film, he had sent Bava over to, I think, England to see The Exorcist, where it was playing and it was doing tremendous business. And Bava came back and said, well, it's a good film, but I don't, this has nothing to do with what we did. I'm not, they're very different movies. Not realizing, of course, that was exactly what the film was going to become. And it was Leone's idea that, Exorcist is big, Exorcist ripoffs are big, so let's make Lisa and the Devil into an exorcism movie. And so The House of Exorcism was born. And what a radically different film that was.
So, how did this masterpiece, Lisa and the Devil, get turned into the piece of crap named The House of Exorcism?
Bava agreed to participate up to a point because he was friends with Leone. However, their friendship became strained over this and also over another project called Rabid Dogs, or became Rabid Dogs, and they had a falling out. So he agreed, and he participated up to a point, shooting some added scenes with Robert Alda as a priest who's very much in the Jason Miller self-doubting priest from The Exorcist mold. Although he's also kind of an older character as well, so he's also kind of evoking Max von Sydow, so it's kind of a 2-for-1 special in a certain sense. Elke Sommer was brought back to do these scenes where she is in a hospital room, vomiting pea soup and vomiting frogs and saying blasphemous dialogue and swearing and everything else. Bava was very uncomfortable with a lot of this stuff, and as a matter of fact, Elke Sommer said that he would come up to her before the take sometime and say, don't say those lines. Don't say that. That's terrible. Don't say those words. Say something else. And Alfredo Leone got really pissed off after a certain point, and basically, that was the point where Bava left the film and refused to participate anymore because he thought that the material was just in very bad taste and he didn't want anything to do with it. So this new material was shot, and Leone assembled it himself. He didn't have Bava with him to help with the editing. It made a lot of money. It was hugely successful, and it did exactly what Alfredo Leone needed it to do, so I guess there's something to be said for that.
Then we have a film that I thought was pretty crappy, Rabid Dogs.
Well, I would disagree. It's a terrible movie. I think it's a fantastic film. I think it's one of his best, as a matter of fact. I definitely think it's one of his greatest films.
Well, I guess I was disappointed because it was not a Bava film. Content-wise, it's more like a seedier Lucio Fulci or Joe D'Amato film. You really couldn't tell that it was Bava who made that film.
Oh, I think you can, but it's done. It was a deliberate attempt to reinvent himself. Obviously, after an experience of a movie like Lisa and the Devil, which was so sort of old-fashioned, he realized that he needed to reinvent himself as a more modern kind of filmmaker and do something that was a little bit more in line with what audiences were interested in. And those kind of crime films and polizieschi were very popular. So that was a deliberate attempt to change it. I think you can see him. I think you can definitely see his style in the compositions and in a variety of different camera movements and so forth. But it's a very different type of movie. I mean, it's not the usual kind of lush, very style-conscious movie. It's much grittier. To me, I think it's one of his best films, but it definitely, well, it ended up being a tragic experience altogether for a whole variety of different reasons, and obviously he didn't live to see it completed anyway.
Rabid Dogs is the story of a gang of mean, sadistic bank robbers who take a woman, a man and a sick son hostage while trying to escape from the police. I remember it was pretty seedy in a bad way, but the final twist in which the father is revealed to be a bad guy redeems quite a lot. I don't know, maybe I should be fair and give this film another chance. So, how did this very unlikely Bava film come into existence?
Story. Basically, he had read this story in an Ellery Queen magazine called, I think it was called A Man and a Boy. And, you know, by this point, he realizes that he needs to do something. If he wants to continue to make films, he has to somehow stay relevant. He has to make something that people actually want to see. So he'd read this story, this crime story, and thought it was fantastic, and went to Alfredo Leone and asked him to buy the rights. And Leone at this point was basically gearing up, wanting to put Bava under a contract. And he had drawn up a contract whereby he was going to put Bava under exclusive contract to him for, I don't know how many years, but basically he was going to produce Bava's films exclusively. He was going to be his producer. A business associate of Leone's was in on some of this stuff and was aware of the fact that Bava wanted to make a different type of movie, a crime movie, a realistic movie, and was aware of the fact that Leone was wanting to do that with him, but wanting to put him under a contract. So he basically screwed Leone. No other way to put it. He screwed Leone. He went out and bought the rights to the story himself, right at the time where Leone was getting ready to buy the rights and draw up all the paperwork and everything else. He went out and stole the rights. Bava found out about this, and of course he was very conflicted. He was like, well, I mean, Leone's my friend, and I don't want to hurt him, but at the same time, I really want to make this movie. I think he felt that if he made this movie and it turned out well and it was successful, it could really re-energize his career and keep him going. Because by this point, he's pushing 60. You know, he's at a point where he's really kind of looking at his own mortality. And of course, he didn't realize he had less than 10 years to live. You know, he died rather young, unfortunately. But I think he really thought that, you know, if I'm going to keep relevant at all, I need to make something that has a chance of connecting with an audience. He thought that was going to be Rabid Dogs, what became known as Rabid Dogs anyway. It wasn't called that at that time. So basically, out of sheer desperation, he agreed to go with this other guy to make the movie. Well, when Leone was told of this, he was livid. He was very pissed off, and understandably so, and there was a lot of bad feelings there for a long time. Leone basically said, you know, if I had produced the film, I would have done it in a way that it would have had international appeal. He said he would have cast somebody like Martin Balsam or Ernest Borgnine in the lead role, the driver. Well, I guess people listening to this probably realize, you know, have seen the film, but you know, he isn't everything that he seems to be. Let's put it that way. And he probably, based on the previous two films, would have had Elke Summer as the kidnap victim. I think that's a safe assumption. Basically, would have had actors who had some international value. And this other production company that did the film didn't really have an eye towards the international marketplace too much, although they did start off with an American leading man, the actor Al Lettieri. I don't know if you're familiar with Al Lettieri, but he was in The Godfather, he was in Mr. Majestic, he was in The Getaway. He was in a lot of films in the 70s. He was a very, very good actor, but unfortunately Al Lettieri was also a chronic alcoholic, and by the time he started working on Rabid Dogs, he was to a point where he just stank of booze, apparently. He was in bad shape. The film was being shot under very, very trying circumstances. You have to remember this film was shot in the summer in 1973. It was a blistering hot summer, and they were shooting inside of a car. And very, very cramped and very, very hot and very, very sweaty. And they had a guy, basically, who was drunk all the time, who was not in good shape, so he shot for a little while. Bava realized that he was just totally unreliable, and he fired him. And so they got another actor, Riccardo Cucciola, to play the part instead. Now, Ricardo Cochiolo was a brilliant actor, and he's fantastic in Rabid Dogs, but nobody knew who he was outside of Italy anyway. He was a distinguished actor in Italy, but to an American or British or any other type of audience, nobody knew who he was. There were no star names attached to the movie, and that was always one of Leone's things about why the movie was kind of doomed from the start. But basically, the money aspect came to be a problem. The producer had to file, I believe the producer had to file for bankruptcy, and all of his assets were seized. And so the movie was effectively locked in a vault for many, many years. It was 99% finished. Bava just wanted to do a few little pickup shots and a couple little things, and that was all. But it was basically finished and ready to go. He had even had an opportunity to do a kind of rough edit. There you go. There was no money to finish it. Stelvio Cipriani had been hired to provide a score. Although it was recorded, it was never officially finished. The sound mix had never been finished, and basically it sat in a vault for many, many years, which of course was very dispiriting to Mario Bava, because that was his movie that he intended to kind of reignite his career, and he wasn't even allowed to finish it. So yeah, I think that hit him pretty hard.
Do you really think that film could have been a hit for Bava if it had been finished?
It would have been interesting, and it could have, if it had been marketed well and if it had been received well. It could have taken him down a very different path. You might have seen him doing a lot of sort of Polizioteschi type films. We'll never know, because his one attempt at it didn't come out. It didn't do what he wanted. I mean, you have to bear in mind, this is coming right on top of Lisa and the Devil basically not getting a release. And then after that, he has to go in and do these god-awful scenes with Robert Alda for The House of Exorcism. He didn't direct anything for a while. I mean, he was pretty quiet for a couple of years after that, and I think he really was, his spirit was kind of broken by all of that. I think he saw himself as basically being pretty much washed up.
Then we have Shock, which sadly became his last film. It's not a worthy last film.
I think Shock's a pretty good film. It actually has some very good scares in it. Again, you can see there that he's sticking to a more realistic approach stylistically. It's not as lush as his earlier films. I think on that film, he was kind of doing a little bit of what Ricardo Freda had done earlier with him on Caltiki, which is to say, at this point, he was very concerned about his son Lamberto becoming a director. He was afraid that Lamberto was just content to be an assistant, and he wanted him to start directing films of his own while he was still, a young man, and had an opportunity to kind of make a name for himself in a way that he felt that he had not done himself. So he directed some scenes of the film, and he entrusted other scenes to his son, and that continued with his next and final feature, which was a TV movie called The Venus of Eel, which was shot on 16 millimeter for Italian television the year after. And there again, Bava directed some scenes himself and entrusted other scenes to his son. They both starred Daria Nicolodi, of course, who was by this time well known for her associations with Dario Argento. I don't know how Venus of Eel went over on Italian television. I don't know if it got much attention or not. Unfortunately, it's not available officially on video, although there are copies of it floating around with English subtitles. It's a lovely little movie, and it has some interesting kind of connections to Black Sunday, which makes it, it's interesting that it wasn't intended to be his last film, but it kind of deals with similar themes and has some similar images, so it's kind of a satisfying finale to his directing career on that level. It almost feels like he came full circle in a way, but I don't know how it went over. I mean, it was made for TV, so I mean, it wouldn't have really gotten a ton of attention. Shock, unfortunately, was exported to the U.S. Marketplace as Beyond the Door Part 2, which is a ridiculous title, and the only reason they did that was because the little boy who's in Shock had been in Beyond the Door, which was the rather poor but very, very profitable Exorcist ripoff with Richard Johnson and Juliette Mills from, I think, 1974. So it just happened to have the same little boy in the cast, so they called it Beyond the Door Part 2, even though it had nothing to do with it. I don't think it was particularly successful. Again, most of Bava's films in Italy really weren't very successful anyway, so that was kind of par for the course. He certainly was never taken very seriously by the critics in Italy. As a matter of fact, two of the only people who wrote enthusiastically about Bava's films during that period, before they became filmmakers themselves, in fact, were Luigi Cozzi and Dario Argento.
Did he have any other projects in the making when he died?
Gearing up to do a science fiction film, I believe it was called Animalia. It gets a little complicated. I can't recall because he was involved with several different science fiction projects at the end of his life. One of them was reportedly going to be produced by Roger Corman. I don't recall which one specifically he was gearing up to make. I know that Dardano Sacchetti wrote one of them. Dardano Sacchetti, of course, wrote a number of Lucio Fulci's best-known horror films. He was gearing up to make a film that was going to be in the science fiction genre. And he, in fact, in order to get the clearance to do this film, he had to have a physical. And he went in and he had his physical, and he was found to be in perfect health. But then a couple of days later, he was gone. He was a heavy smoker. He was a workaholic. He looked a lot older than he really was. If you see the pictures of him, particularly after Rabid Dogs, it's like the experience of Rabid Dogs and Lisa and the Devil really aged him prematurely. Martin Scorsese apparently met him in the 1970s, late 1970s, and he thought he was in his 80s. But he was only 65 when he died. So he had worked himself very, very hard down through the years. He was a workaholic. He didn't like sitting still. Again, he wasn't particularly happy at home in some respects. It sounds as though his marriage wasn't a very happy one. So sometimes when things aren't good at home, you want to keep yourself busy somewhere else. So he was always working. Even Daria Nicolodi commented on how he showed up at her house not long before he died and was complaining about he needs to quit smoking. He's starting to get cramps in his feet and all this different stuff. And she was very attached to him and really loved him a lot, and took his death very, very hard, apparently. Again, 65. He was short of his 66th birthday. He would have turned 66 that year in 1980, but within a relatively short period of time, in 1980, you had three major kind of horror suspense genre filmmakers dying. Mario Bava, Alfred Hitchcock, and Terence Fisher. All three of them died during that year, so that was a pretty bad year.
Och med de här orden så var det slut för den här gången. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller. Musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då!